Okay, so we're going to dive into one of the absolute strangest and honestly most misunderstood events in all of military history. It's a story that on the surface sounds like a complete joke, but trust me, it reveals some pretty surprising truths about power, politics, and the limits of human control. I mean, that's the big question, isn't it? It sounds completely absurd. You have a modern army with modern machine guns going up against a flock of flightless birds, and the birds won. How does that even happen? Well, the answer tells us a lot more than just who won a weird battle. Because, yeah, while the image of soldiers chasing birds is pretty funny, the story behind it is anything but. This wasn't just some wacky pest control mission. Nope. It was the last desperate act in a long chain of social, economic, and even ecological failures. It's a powerful parable, and that's exactly what we're going to unpack here. So let's reframe this whole thing. We're going to move way past the punchline and start looking at how this bizarre little episode actually serves as a really serious and fascinating case study. And this quote just hits the nail on the head. Historians now look at the Emu War not as some silly story, but as a window into a nation in crisis, a country that was grappling with forces it just could not control, both in its economy and literally in its own backyard. So how in the world did we get here? Well, this war didn't just pop up out of nowhere. It was the result of a perfect storm, a whole series of crises that all crashed together in the wheat fields of Western Australia. And it created this tinderbox of desperation. And as you can see here, that storm really had three big parts. First, a social failure. After World War I, Australia gave veterans land to farm, but it was terrible land, basically doomed from the start. Second, an economic failure. The Great Depression hits, the price of wheat just collapses, and these farmers are facing total ruin. And finally, an ecological failure. All these new farms accidentally created a paradise for emus right on top of their ancient migration routes. This quote just perfectly sums up the politics of it. For the government, who was facing these angry veterans that they had failed, the emus, well, they were the perfect scapegoat. Declaring war on them was this big, flashy way to look like they were doing something, without ever having to admit the real problem was their own bad policy. And what was happening here is a brilliant example of a concept called ecological blowback. You see, the farmers thought they were being invaded by 20,000 emus, but the reality? The humans had invaded the ecosystem first. The emus weren't attacking, they were just doing what animals do, responding to a brand new, massive source of food and water that we had just created for them. The war was just a violent attempt to fix a problem that we ourselves had caused. All right, so the stage is set. The government, mostly for political cover, agrees to send in the actual military. And this brings us to the campaign itself, which was really just one tactical failure after another, a series of public embarrassments that would go down in history. You can understand the whole problem just by looking at this slide. The army showed up ready to fight World War I all over again. They had tactics for trench warfare, for suppressive fire against big groups of static targets. But the emus, well, they didn't exactly fight by the book. They didn't group up in formations. They scattered in every direction. They weren't static. They could run at 50 kilometers an hour. It was, as one expert later said, pure guerrilla tactics. And the results were, well, predictably terrible. The very first ambush on November 2nd, total failure. The birds just ran away in small groups. 2 days later, they set up a perfect ambush for 1,000 emus, and the machine gun jammed after killing maybe a dozen of them. They even tried mounting a gun on a truck, but they couldn't keep up, and it was too bumpy to aim. After just 6 days of this and getting absolutely roasted in the press, the military was ordered to withdraw. Now, they did get sent back out there a second time, but the final numbers, they tell a story of just shocking inefficiency. Just look at this data. The army fired almost 10,000 rounds of ammunition to get just under 1,000 confirmed kills. So you do the math, and the official kill-to-round ratio comes down to this one single damning number. 10. 10 rounds of ammunition for every single emu. I mean, by any military standard, that is an astonishingly wasteful and ineffective campaign, a complete and utter tactical failure. And you can just feel the sheer frustration in the words of the commanding officer, Major Meredith. He actually compared the emus to tanks. He said they seemed to have the bullet-carrying capacity to take on any army in the world. That is a pretty stark admission of defeat from the man in charge. So the military leaves, the press is having a field day, and for all intents and purposes, the emus are victorious. But the problem for the farmers? It's still there. So this forced a major shift towards solutions that actually worked. Wow, this chart really says it all, doesn't it? The big military campaign, with all its resources, officially took out less than 1,000 emus. Now, look what happened when the government just switched to a simple bounty system a couple years later. In just 6 months, local farmers and hunters, using their own know-how, claimed bounties on over 57,000 emus. The difference is it's incredible. So the real solutions ended up being far more practical. First, those decentralized bounties worked because they used local knowledge. But the biggest solution was even simpler: strong fences. They shifted from active conflict to just passive prevention. And, maybe most importantly, the government learned its lesson. When farmers asked for military help again in later years, the government said no way, because they were not about to be publicly humiliated like that ever again. And that kind of leaves us with this final thought to chew on. The Great Emu War is just this really humbling reminder that sometimes, when we get into these huge conflicts with the natural world, we're not actually fighting nature's aggression. We might just be fighting a reflection of our own mistakes, our own unintended consequences coming back to bite us.